Hello, everybody. I'm Judith Rosenbaum from the Jewish Women's Archive, and I am really delighted to have the opportunity to talk today with Ayelet Tsabari about her wonderful book of short stories, The Best Place on Earth, which I have right here.
Hi, everyone.
And which is one of JWA's book club picks this year. And we're really excited to have this chance to talk to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So I have to say, I really enjoyed reading these stories. And I was particularly struck by the fact that most of the stories are about women. Most of the stories are about Mizrahi Jews, and many are of young people as well. And this really struck me because at JWA, at the Jewish Women's Archive, part of our mission is about expanding the Jewish narrative and the range of role models that are available to people.
Yeah.
We focus on including women and also the stories of other people whose stories have traditionally not been told. And one of our mottos is, if you can see it, you can be it. And so I was wondering if you see that as sort of an explicit goal in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I often speak about, you know, the work of a writer. There's so much mystery about it. There's so many choices that we're not that aware that we're making, well, first person versus third person, or, there's so many constant and deliberate choosing as we go along. But that wasn't one of those things. Like, that was a definite, a decision. I was on a mission when I was writing these stories. I wanted to basically create the characters that were missing from my childhood stories, so that was a very conscious decision to populate the book with Mizrahi characters, because I love what you said. How did you say that? If you see it,
if you can see it, you can be it.
That's right? Because I didn't see myself as a child being represented in literature, and I also didn't see any Yemeni authors out there either. So that's, for a child who wants to write, that really didn't make me feel like that dream was possible. So that was really important. I knew what I was doing with that one. You know what I mean? I'm creating those characters. I'm creating love interests that are, brown and have curly hair, and are not always the fair-skinned and blonde characters that I was used to from my childhood. And that was a hard one for me even to change. I found myself reverting to that constantly, because it's so hard to break those things that we, that have been imprinted in us since childhood. So yeah, I'm glad you're starting with that. That's definitely was important to me. And the thing about women too, I was told by a teacher once that my women characters are very assertive, that they go for what they want, and they I think he said badasses. I'm hearing that it's a little bit poppy, so I'm gonna make it a little further. And that, for example, was something that I wasn't aware of. That's a good example. But again, I can see why I did that in retrospect, because I wanted to see more female characters that have agency, that are assertive, even sometimes a little bit aggressive. I mean, coming from Israel, there's a lot of strong women out here. Not out there, I'm here. But yeah, so I think that was something that was not as conscious, but I'm really glad to hear that it resonates with people.
Yeah, and I loved how you put that directly into the work also. Like, there's sort of reference to, like, I'm thinking about in the story about Uri, the poets in the kitchen window, how he, as a young Mizrahi guy who is interested in poetry, is really excited when he comes across an Iraqi poet and thinks, oh my God, I didn't know that was even a possibility.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I also felt like your book challenged some of the other usual narratives that we hear outside of Israel about Israel. Most, I would say, of the ways that Israel shows up in the news is around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And while there certainly are a lot of global context to the stories and a lot of things that are going on around war and violence and conflict. Most of the Arabs in this book are Jews. And while there are many different kinds of conflict that appear, most of them are more kind of internal to Israeli society and sort of conflicts among Jews of different backgrounds or different people who are living within Israel. So I was wondering also how much that was a kind of explicit choice for you or a goal for you to kind of create this alternative narrative or way for people to encounter Israel as a country.
Sure. Yeah. That was a conscious decision as well. It has a few layers to this. I'm trying to decide where to start, where to enter into this answer. I guess whenever I think about other places in the world that are, distraught by war, and I don't really want to read just personally. I prefer to know the stories of the people. I'm interested in the families. I'm interested in, I always say I'm interested in mini conflicts rather than the conflict. I'm interested in the way people communicate and interact. And yes, I am interested in the way that the political affects the personal. And of course, in most places like that, like in Israel, it's very much entwined. It's hard to separate the two. And I think that's what I was trying to do, really, is to sort of bring to the page the way I know life in Israel is, that the foreground is just people living their lives, falling in love and breaking up and fighting with their siblings and getting hurt and feeling a range of emotions. And then in the background, there's always the conflict and there's always war and terror and the situation, which is that, that bland euphemism we use. That's what it is. That's life in Israel. That to me is very true to it. There are days pass when we don't talk about any of that. And sometimes when things are really bad, that's when we talk about it the least. You know what I mean? Like we sort of have to protect ourselves. So I was trying to capture that in writing those stories when, they're all, again, against the background of those events, but the events are not the story. And that was exactly what I was trying to do. And as far as the characters, I find it so interesting that the question of, including Palestinian characters in the book is something that I've been asked about. And of course there is one. I know there's only one. And for me, because, nowadays, I would say that there are more crossovers between, the Palestinian society and the Jewish one in Israel. It's a little more mixed, despite things maybe looking worse. There's also more of a coexistence in certain ways. When I was growing up, it didn't really feel that way. I didn't know Arabs. I didn't know Palestinians. I never met them anywhere. Not in my schools, not in my workplaces. There was such segregation back then.
And where was your family living when you were growing up?
In Petah Tikva. And I do see that there's a lot more of a mix happening nowadays, which is great. It's one hopeful element of the change that I see in the 20 years that since I've moved and came back. But it felt really forced to try and insert a character just for the sake, of inserting a character. That's not how fiction works,
right.
anyway.
Or aligning with what people would expect or something.
Exactly. And then I had to also consider just whose story I'm telling, and sort of remove that burden of representing an entire nation. representing Israel as a whole. Like, it's too
Mhm.
much. No one can do that. It's
Right.
impossible. No one should.
And no one would
So
expect that if you were an American writer, right? If you were writing about the US, no one would
exactly,
expect you to speak to every aspect or to the expected
exactly,
aspects. But it's only
exactly.
when you're representing someplace that is, maybe outside the norm or considered a small
Yeah,
place with one where people know one story about it.
that's exactly it. The one story. I mean, that's what people expect when they hear that it's a book about Israel. They expect that one story. It's like that beautiful talk by Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, where she speaks
Mhm.
about the single story. That's what they wanted from it. And that's why it kind of raises a brow when it didn't deliver that single story.
Right. So
Yeah.
did reception sort of push back against that in your work?
I have. I remember when I was preparing for my defense, because the book was my MFA thesis.
Mm-hmm.
I was preparing for that question. And someone, I don't remember who, when I told them I was preparing for that question, said, "That's crazy. Why would I want to ask you that?" And sure enough, I was asked that.
Interesting.
Um, and then I saw that in a couple um, reviews, and even with my most recent book, it already came up
Mm-hmm.
in a couple of reviews that
Interesting.
I don't, that I mention that, but that's not um, at the heart of the book.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It's mostly interesting to
Right.
me.
Right.
Hmm.
It gives you a sense of what other people are expecting to see more than
Yeah.
anything else. Yeah. I think the other piece that really struck me around that's related to what we were just talking about in terms of kind of sharing different perspective and maybe unexpected perspectives on Israel and on Israeli society was the way that your characters also contain or complicate lots of different identities. So I was thinking particularly around in one of your stories about two different immigrants to Israel, two young women who come to Israel,
Yeah.
one from Belarus and one from Canada.
Hmm.
And the one from Canada is also from, like you, from a Yemenite
Yemeni background.
family,
Hmm.
and is trying to explain that you can be both an Arab and a Jew.
Hmm.
And the character from Belarus is like, no, you're one or the other. But then she
Yeah.
says, at a certain point, she says something like, well, we're all Israeli now anyway. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the way that Israeliness is so complicated.
Hmm. Yeah, that was something um, that I found a little bit difficult um, to sort of convey to the North American um, audiences. Like, there was work involved in that. Like, I remember early readers often said that that was complicated. I didn't get this. So wait a second, where's she from? Like, that was, I kept like bumping against that. But I wasn't going to budge, and I wasn't going to simplify, because my whole idea was, I'm here to complicate
Mm-hmm.
your idea of Israel. I'm here to broaden that single story. So I wasn't going to make it easy for you, because that's what it is, right? So for me, especially as someone, because it's not only a book about Israel, it's a book about immigrants often. There are many immigrants to Israel, immigrants away from Israel. And once you're an immigrant, obviously, your identity becomes even more complicated. And that was something I learned, from my own experience living in Canada. And at some point, I became comfortable uh, with the multiplicities of identities. Whenever I'm asked, like, are you a Jewish writer? Are you a woman writer? I'm like, I don't care. It's all good. I'm this and that. I'm a Mizrahi writer. I don't feel as attached to it
Mm-hmm.
as others. It doesn't. The question itself doesn't seem that important to me. I accept that we all have multiplicity of identities, and I embrace that. I think that's sort of what's a big part of what inspires my writing. Um, so yeah. Um, So
Right.
yeah, that was definitely there when I was writing, for sure.
In some ways, I feel like the stories could actually be the response to that question being like, that's the wrong question, right? Like
Yeah.
in some ways, your stories speak for themselves and saying like, if you're asking a question of what are you, that
Hmm.
already is too limiting a question.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
and maybe not
Yeah.
the right question.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
But I think that your stories also really give, um, they're honest about the fact that those are questions people grapple with, and that can be very
Yeah.
confusing if you're not quite sure who you are, where you fit.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And I think that gets also at this question of location, which obviously is a huge theme in the book, right? It's called The
Yeah.
Best Place on Earth.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about kind of the role of place in this book and in your writing, both,
Hmm.
as a topic, but also, as you said, as somebody who has lived in many different places.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fascinated with place, and I'm fascinated with writing place and doing it well. This is something I love, an element of craft that I really enjoy. Uh, the evoking of place and creating a sense of place. I've been a traveler, um, you know, not just as an adult, even as a teenager. I used to travel a lot in the country. I was a fan of random buses. It was back when it was okay to let your teenager just go. Um, so yeah, place fascinates me. And then personally as well, there's the places in our history, the place that I can't go to, Yemen, which kind of looms in the back of my mind. I find it hard to accept that I cannot visit. Um, so yeah, I guess that was something, again, like I said, there's a lot of it that is sort of unplanned. And I think as I was putting the stories together, that fascination with place was becoming clear to me. I can't say that I thought that that's what I was doing necessarily. And the title of the story, of the book, and the story too, it's funny because it was actually from a license plate in British Columbia in Canada. It said, "Beautiful British Columbia, the best place on earth."
Mm.
And I remember when I first saw it, when I moved there, and I looked at it and I thought to myself, who do you think you are?
Okay.
And it made me think about, what is the best place? And I imagined, and that was kind of the kernel that started that story, The Best Place on Earth, which is the final story in the collection. It made me think of someone from, say, Jerusalem, this amazing, holiest place to so many in the world. Someone seen that written on a license plate, and yeah, it just made me think of what is it,
Mm-hmm.
and how it is different things for different people, and how we are all just seeking a place that we can call our own, and a place that we can feel comfortable, uh, and like we belong, and how universal that is. And that's kind of what led to that story,
Mm-hmm.
and what, after I read the entire collection as a whole, realized that it was the perfect title for the entire book.
What do you think, or how did you see as you were putting this together, the relationship between the best place on earth and home?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I want to say that it's probably is one and the same, but then again, for a child who's growing up in a home that is not good for her, obviously it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking it's probably the home we sort of select for ourselves later on in life, and it could be the same place. Like, here I am back in Israel. I'm still not sure that it's the best place for me, but I'm back here. So yeah, it's a complicated relationship, for
Mm-hmm.
sure. And others would say that it's not even a place at all, right? that it's people, that it's a community, that it's, you know, something inside of us, that it's us, you know, like how happy we are in the world. So yeah.
Or something imagined, something that you long for but never arrive at. I mean,
Yeah.
I think about that often, you know, in terms of like the Jewish story and Israel, that there's, you know, so many years of longing for a place and
Yeah.
seeing it as home, and then when there's a reality of a place, there's different issues that surround.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is definitely an Israeli predicament, that the home that we, you know, longed for, and obviously I'm talking about ancestors, um, ended up being a place that is not really safe, and often, you know, contested and often shifting, and yeah.
And that houses so many people who aren't from there, or, you know,
Hmm.
you know, who are immigrants. So everybody is kind of making it. I mean, obviously there are people who have lived there for many generations, but
Yeah.
most people haven't. And so
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing to sort of think about how, you know, getting back to that question of all these different identities, sort of how people come together to create one
Yeah.
place.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm thinking also about the relationship between home and language, because I just thought it was so interesting that you write in English, which isn't,
Yeah.
I'm assuming, your native language.
No.
So how did that happen? And do you feel at home in English? And what is that like for you?
Do I feel home in English? How did that happen first? It happened over time. It happened gradually. I never set out to do it. I didn't choose to do it. I sort of fell into it. And I know it sounds awfully passive, but that's kind of my story also with Canada. You know, I drifted there and I didn't plan on staying, and then suddenly 20 years passed. So it's a similar thing for me. When I first arrived in Canada, I couldn't fathom writing in anything other than Hebrew. I didn't want to write in anything other than Hebrew because I love Hebrew. You know, it's my mother tongue. I've written in it since I could write, and I read Hebrew, and I love it. But back then, there weren't many opportunities for me to speak Hebrew in Vancouver. It was before social media. There was no just like that regular exchange, that sometimes daily exchange. You know, I didn't call home every day. I didn't know Israelis in the city. So my Hebrew did start to sort of suffer because I was living my life entirely in English. So yeah, something in that balance, and my English wasn't that great either. So for a while, I was really having some serious identity crisis. You already have an identity crisis when you immigrate, and then there's also the feeling of I can't communicate, I can't express myself perfectly in each language. To some extent, I feel that even now here. Now that I came here and now I'm living my life in Hebrew, but I'm still writing in English. And now, for example, when I'm talking to you, sometimes I'm like, I'm not as fluent, you know, as I was like a few months ago. So there's something I kind of do, I see, I had a Hebrew word. I kind of created to myself the situation where I'm always sort of not perfect in either language. And of course, I'm really glad that I can write in two languages. So that's the price that comes with it, right? So it's the same as immigration. It's basically it's parallel. It's a parallel experience. You know, I'm so lucky that I've experienced life in another place, and that I have two places that I can, in theory, call home. But it comes with a price, and the price is that, in a sense, I'm a bit foreign and a bit of a stranger in both places. So that would apply also to English, and to some extent also to Hebrew. I mentioned it to someone the other day, and I said that sometimes I struggle a little bit. Like when I was asked to write something in Hebrew, I found it a bit challenging, and I said that's a bummer. And I said it doesn't have to be, you know. Like again, like this kind of duality and dislocation. These are all things that are a big part of what inspires my writing. So I've learned to, instead of like being sad about it, I've learned to accept that as a part of what makes me who I am, and what makes my writing perhaps unique. Yeah. So do I feel at home? I feel like an immigrant in English, with everything that involves. Sometimes I feel, you know what I mean? Like sometimes I feel at home there, but there's always a sense of foreignness, which I think for me, that challenge for writing is a really good thing.
Right? Maybe it gives you a certain attention. It like forces a certain attention to language that you might not have
Yeah.
in a native sense. And in some ways,
Yeah.
I feel like it means, like, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about how it means that as a writer, you're really sort of embodying the themes that you're writing about, right? Like you are living, like, really in them in a way
Exactly.
that is not abstract at all.
Exactly. It's like it's so apt that, that this was a book that was written in one language about another language, from one place about another place. For this book, and probably for the next book, it's fitting. Yeah.
So speaking of the next book, I know you have a memoir, The Art of Leaving, that is about to come out.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about that. And I'm curious also about how the process of writing a memoir is different from writing fiction.
Yeah. Okay, so the book is coming out, and it's very stressful, especially because it's a memoir. And why do people write memoir? I do not know. It is about very similar themes. Some people who have read it already commented on it, that they seem complementary, the books. It sort of traces my life from childhood to motherhood. And the reasons that I chose to leave over and over again, my home, my family, my country, my language, partners, and sort of comes full circle because motherhood is sort of the anti-leaving. So that's kind of in a few words what it's about. Writing a memoir was not something I knew I was doing. When I started to write in English, I couldn't really imagine writing fiction. It seemed too big and too ambitious, and I liked the idea. I just discovered that genre of creative nonfiction, and I was blown away by the idea that people craft their own lives into stories, and I thought, how neat. You can do that. I didn't know you could do that. And I just started sort of writing all these anecdotes from my life, not even full stories at that time. And slowly they became full stories or essays. And for a long time, they were disparate, pieces. And I almost struggle to describe what it is. Is it essays? Is it pieces? Is it stories? Is it short memoir? There's not really a good title for short form creative nonfiction or short form memoir. And then when I put them together, it was clear that there's a cohesiveness and that there's a trajectory that leads somewhere. And then I filled up the gaps with a few more pieces. So for me, it wasn't really like, here I'm writing in a new genre after I was doing fiction. I was doing both at the same time, and I'm a junkie for the story. I'm a slave to the story. So it was in a sense, yes, it was very different because I was, minding my own life, or I was writing completely imagined stories. But on the other hand, it wasn't. in terms of craft, in terms of, scenes and summaries, and finding the conflict, and finding a lot of the craft elements for me are similar. And yes, they both have their constraints, both genres. You can't make up stuff. And that's one of the, I love that constraint. I think that is, I've already said, I think that I love the challenge, and I think it makes me a better writer. That's why I write in English. And so for me, creating stories from my own life, translating lived experience into stories and into art, was a challenge that I really enjoyed. Yeah.
Well, we're really looking forward to reading it. And we're so grateful that you shared your stories with us, both the ones from your life and the ones that are from your more imagination.
That's right.
Your reflections on the world around you.
Yeah.
And are really grateful that you've helped expand the availability of different models of what womanhood looks like, what Israeliness looks like, what Mizrahi identity looks like.
Thank you.
And we're really very excited to be able to share this book with our readers.
Thank you so much. Yeah.